fake space and the stationary plane Earth are not theories supported by some circumstantial evidence only, but are instead immutable, self-evident truths which perfectly agree with repeatable experience and observation, as well as all physical experimentation you can possibly imagine. The globe Earth / infinite space belief systems are indeed theories supported by some circumstantial evidence, but only if a litany of caveats are granted for argument's sake. Upon closer skeptical examination, however, the belief in infinite space and the spinning ball Earth are 100% false. Indeed, all physical evidence and the results of practical, simple experiments confirm that fake space and the hypothetical spinning ball world are nothing more than a fantasy, a massive delusion on the grandest of scales. In this video, we'll review, in rapid-fire succession, some of the countless facts and arguments which form the crucial preponderance of evidence forming a basis for the modern exodus away from the globe Earth and infinite space theories. This change of paradigm doesn't come easily, as even when confronted with simple facts which disagree with or even disprove the theory of a spinning ball Earth zipping through infinite space in multiple directions at the same time, we are culturally programmed to reject these facts in a form of cognitive dissonance. It's really up to each individual to deprogram themselves. However, the more facts we have to bring to the table, the better. This isn't to say that we need to have all the answers, as simply disproving one element of the spinning ball Earth infinite space hypotheses disproves the entirety of that paradigm. So in other words, if you can show that the Earth doesn't have curvature, then it couldn't be a sphere, and no further argument is necessary to prove that the Earth isn't a sphere. The nose-diving plane phenomenon is something that can't be ignored either. If an airplane takes off and travels around accelerating in any direction, gaining altitude, dropping altitude, banking left, banking right, accelerate, decelerate, doesn't matter. If that plane performs a proper nosedive, it will always perform a nosedive above a perfectly stationary Earth. If the world was indeed spinning around, independent of the plane, which has taken off and accelerated in lots of different directions, when that plane did a nosedive, it would simply not be adherent to the frame of reference with the Earth. This one thing is a standalone evidence against the purported motion of the Earth. So these points range from physical experiments, common experiences, to astronomical and theoretical. The first two categories, physical experiments and common experiences, do an excellent job to prove the stationary and non-curved nature of the world, while the latter, astronomical and theoretical points, really debunk the standing theory of a spinning ball Earth. Keep in mind, when the ball Earth theory was originally postulated, things like airplanes, lasers, weather balloons with digital cameras, the internet, instant communication, etc., all these technologies weren't available to the originators of the ball Earth theory, which gives us, in the modern era, a major advantage over philosophers and scientists from eras past. Furthermore, when the ball Earth theory was postulated, it was mainly due to astronomical observations and not due to practical experiments or experiences, which would lead any unbiased observer to naturally think that they live stuck to the side of a spinning ball. All of the points covered in this video will either provide direct evidence against the ball Earth theory, dispute or debunk circumstantial evidence referenced in support of the ball Earth theory, or attest to common physical experiences which do not align with the underlying theories which hypothetically support the ideas of fake space or a spinning ball Earth. Some of these points are standalone proofs, although many are entire categories of proof with multiple, perhaps infinite instances one could point to in relation to that category. Many standalone proofs are sufficient to debunk the infinite space or globe Earth theories without any further investigation or explanation required on the part of the flat Earth proponent. So to use an analogy, if it looks like a duck, but it has two sets of petals and will fit two adults across a lake, then it couldn't be a duck and is probably a paddle boat. Similarly, if the Earth is believed to be a rotating orbiting ball, but has no curvature and is demonstrably at rest, then it cannot be a spinning ball, regardless of what we were led to believe our entire lives. So the first point we'll cover briefly is distant towering objects are visible beyond the threshold allowed by the globe. Now in this video we're certainly not going to try to cover all of the points or proofs that align with the flat Earth, because there are an infinite number of things probably, but we're just going to sort of rapid fire go through several. And there are arguments, never-ending, infinite arguments to all of these things, but practically speaking, when you have dozens of facts which align to a stationary planar Earth as opposed to a spinning ball Earth, then the case for a spinning ball Earth really does dwindle to nothing. So the first point we'll talk about is distant towering objects which are visible beyond the threshold allowed hypothetically by the ball Earth. Many examples, probably infinite examples, could be given where objects are visible far further than they physically should be visible were the Earth indeed a ball. All of these instances amount to one specific proof, which technically should be enough to end any discussion or debate about the Earth's sphericity. So whether you're talking about the Chicago skyline from around 60 miles away, observed from about water level, or whether you're talking about the 273 mile distant peaks seen here, where the tip top of the mountain shown here should be over a half a mile below the horizon line, if the Earth were indeed a ball. So, I mean, you could go on with probably hundreds of these examples, but the fact of the matter is, we can see further than we should if the Earth was indeed a ball. So this really should end any discussion or debate, but of course the ball Earth believers will start arguing standard refraction causes the spherical Earth to elusively present itself as a plane, regardless of the distance being observed, regardless of the observer's altitude. The ball Earth always presents itself as a plane very elusively due to refraction, which is of course absurd, but that's the type of arguments you get to being able to see way further than you should be able to see were the Earth indeed a ball. Now it's important to mention that when people like Christopher Columbus argued that ships disappear over the horizon bottom first, therefore the Earth is a ball, they were assuming that light always travels in straight lines and the Earth is curving underneath the light. Now we know better than that, as refraction does indeed cause light to bend, and furthermore refraction will cause light to bend towards the higher density gradient. So we can expect light to bend towards the ground, and yet we're expected to believe that light will magically, for example, cause the instance of these 273 mile distant mountains to rise up like 3 miles into the air in order for the ball Earth to deviously present itself as a plane over this distance. Now the second point we'll talk about is the horizon level rises with the observer regardless of altitude. Now, were the Earth indeed a ball, we should expect to see the horizon drop proportionally with an observer's altitude, but regardless of altitude, the horizon always rises with the observer. Now, furthermore, and we'll touch on this more in depth in another point, but camera tricks are used, like fisheye lenses are used to create the illusion that the curvature can be seen from, say, a weather balloon. And so this is rather devious, but it implants the idea that we should be able to witness vast amounts of curvature from, say, 100,000 foot in the air. So whether or not we should see this amount of curvature from, say, the Red Bull jump with Felix Baumgartner, it is presented as such. And frankly, regardless of altitude, we don't see any of this curvature with a non-fisheye lens, with a regular lens, nor with the human eye. And we also don't see the horizon level dropping proportionally with altitude, as you would expect were the Earth indeed a sphere, and the horizon was caused by the spherical Earth dropping away from a single point at a distance from the observer. Indeed, that is what the globe earthers purport, is that the horizon is caused by the spherical Earth dropping away beyond a certain point. Now, we know that this is caused by perspective, and so that fits nicely with the fact that regardless of how high you get in a, say, weather balloon, because that's the highest observation point where we can place cameras, you don't see this evidence of the horizon dropping proportionally with altitude. The horizon remains at eye level, which is exactly what you'd expect upon a practically infinite plane. The third thing we'll look at is Polaris does not behave in accordance with the globe Earth theory. Since the ball Earth theory is largely founded upon astronomical observations, it's very important whenever the infinite space hypothetical construct of space is shown to be out of line with observable reality. Because again, the construct of infinite space and all of the science of astronomy is based on the notion that we are within infinite space and the stars are all around us, when in fact we are upon a stationary plane and the stars are just above us. Not infinitely distant galaxies and suns and planets, but merely mysterious lights in the night sky above our heads. Now, it isn't flat earthers who need to bring astronomical arguments to the table in order to support our position. However, since the globe Earth theory is practically only around as a result of astronomical observations, which indeed spurred wild imaginations of eras past, it is very important to show that the construct of space is fallacious. It doesn't match observations. So Polaris is a perfect indicator of this. You could probably do dozens of bullet points to go along with Polaris, but I think the biggest point to raise, or one of the biggest points to raise with Polaris, is the fact that it is aligned to the so-called axis of rotation of the Earth. Nearly perfectly aligned with that axis of rotation, and it has been so for all of recorded history, and at least for my entire life. Now, I've only been around for about 36 years or so, and at this point we should have seen, in my lifespan alone, a great divergence in alignment between our so-called axis and Polaris, due to the fact that we have the precession of the equinoxes. Now, the precession of the equinoxes is a 26,000 year cycle, which is observable, and ball Earth theory purports, and must purport, that this precession cycle is caused by the Earth's axis slowly precessing through a great wobble once every 26,000 years. Now, when you do the math on this, this equates to about 1 degree of precession every 72 years. And if you reduce that further down to something that we can observe in our lifetimes, that would be a half a degree in 36 years. So since the time that I was born, we should have seen a half a degree of precession along this. That's talking about arc minutes of this wobble as opposed to degrees or minutes in space. But that is substantial enough to where we should not have this dead-on balls, near perfect alignment with Polaris over 36 years. The simple truth is we should have seen a long precession of North Pole stars if the Earth's wobbling axis was indeed to explain the precession cycle. The simple truth is Polaris is always and will always be aligned to the central position of all the other stars, which is simply incompatible with the theory of a spinning ball Earth. phases of the moon don't match up to the globe Earth theory. So anyone can attest to and prove and demonstrate and observe the fact that the full moon is often visible overhead during broad daylight, or a barely visible crescent moon, say 3 or 6% crescent moon, as being visible many hours after sunset into the midnight hours. This is 100% incompatible with the ball Earth theory, as the phases of the moon should be indicative of the moon's position relative to the Earth. During the full moon phase, the moon should be 180 degrees opposite the sun, according to an observer on the Earth. This means that if an observer in broad daylight, say 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, or say 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, we're talking about well into the hours of daylight, being able to observe a full moon is 100% incompatible with the ball Earth theory. The full moon should be completely on the opposite side of the ball Earth, according to an observer during the day, and yet we can see the moon clearly overhead in the broad daylight hours. The reverse is true for the crescent moon, when we can see the barely visible 3 or 6% crescent moon visible many hours into the night, when it should be on the opposite side of the Earth, according to an observer on the night side of the Earth. So this is simple geometry that disagrees or debunks the theory of the spinning ball Earth, because the phases of the moon should dictate very precisely where the moon is in relation to the Earth and the sun, and even one instance where the full moon is visible during the day, many hours after sunrise or before sunset, debunks the ball Earth theory. Visible space doesn't drastically change every 3 months. Now, we should expect to see exclusive stars, especially stars aligned to the Earth's equator, every 6 months, with a 180 degree change in the direction which visible space happens to be every 6 months. And furthermore, we should have specific sets of stars or constellations which are only visible in each season. So we should see a change in the visible overhead equatorial stars, or stars that are roughly aligned to the Earth's equator, every 3 months. The fact is, we can see all of the same stars from at least somewhere on Earth all year long, especially when we're talking about equatorial stars, or stars that are overhead the equator. We should see a complete change in the visible night sky every 3 months, with a 180 degree change in alignment every 6 months. This has nothing to do with how distant you may place the stars. In fact, the further out you place the stars, the more difficult this problem comes to rectify in the ball Earth theory. The constellations have never changed in all of history, although the ball Earth theory purports that the Earth, the Sun, the galaxy, and all the other stars are in constant motion. In the theory of space-time, the constellations have never changed. The stars have never misaligned from the constellations which were ascribed to them thousands of years ago, which is a huge piece of evidence against the ball Earth infinite space theory. And in fact, the constellations have never changed even a slight degree over the course of human history, which is a big piece of evidence against the infinite space hypothesis. The theory of gravity has no experimental verification in all of history. Now, everyone assumes the Earth is a ball in outer space, with the magical force of gravity allowing for everything from loose objects to fall to the ground, all the way to gravity allows for the moon to orbit. Also, gravity is responsible for the creation of stars and planets, the behavior of gyroscopes, etc., etc. The fact is, gravity, in terms of Einstein's theory of gravity as being sort of a warping of the space-time theory, is a theoretical construct which has no experimental evidence. Now, this is not to argue what goes up must come down, which is a natural observation, and if you loose an object which falls to the ground, it doesn't prove the theory of gravity. that is merely a demonstration of the fact or the natural phenomenon, what goes up must come down. So you cannot construct a theory called gravity to explain the fact that what goes up will fall, and then point to objects falling as proof of your theory. It is flawed logic, it is pseudoscience, and the only sort of experimental evidence there is for gravity is the Cavendish experiment, which is laughable and in no way proves the theory of gravity.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next question. This is called gravity.
Oh, Matt, we used to do that. Ultimately, a dead end.
Nowhere on Earth can you find high-density mass being attractive to other mass. You would expect gravity to be scalable. So let's say you take a high-density metal, like a ball of, I don't know, solid wrought iron, a high-density metal, and drop it on the floor and dump flour, baking flour all around it. Now, not in a million years would you expect to see the particles of flour begin to coalesce around the high-density ball of iron, and there is no sort of experimental evidence to suggest that such a thing would ever happen, and yet that is exactly what we're expected to believe occurred during the formation of stars and planets, etc. The hypothetical formation of stars and planets is another sort of conundrum which we must believe or swallow in order to believe in the spinning ball Earth, where you've got diffuse gases or nebula which exist in the infinite vacuum of space, where it is physically not possible to have a pressurized gaseous substance exist in sort of a cloud form within a vacuum. That defies the laws of thermodynamics, defies the laws of fluid dynamics, and you simply must believe in complete falsehoods in order to believe in the ball. This is just one example of that. Airline flight durations do not match what you'd expect to see on a rotational, moving world. The fact is, a westbound flight from New York to LA is often similar, if not identical in duration to its return flight. This alone proves that the Earth is not spinning, 1,000 miles an hour towards the east. If the Earth and all fixed destinations were indeed spinning towards the east, a westbound plane or a westbound flight should be far shorter in duration than its return flight, due to the fact that all destinations should be racing towards the nose of the plane, which is traveling independently of the Earth's reference frame. It is argued by Globers that a westbound flight will continue traveling, say, 1,000 miles an hour towards the east with the destination, with the frame of reference of everything else, and it will retain that 1,000 miles per hour east frame of reference, regardless of how fast or heavily it accelerates towards the west. This is in stark contrast to simple laws of physics, immutable, demonstrable laws of physics, and yet we're expected to believe that westbound flights are often similar or identical even on occasion in duration to their respective return flights, which is completely incompatible with the theory of a spinning ball Earth. The moon's shadow during solar eclipses is usually around 50 miles in diameter, and has been recorded at least a few times as small as 2 miles in diameter. This goes against any demonstrable physical experiment you can do with light and shadow, as shadows cast by an object, and especially a spherical object, the shadow cast by that object will always be at least as large as the cross-section of the object which is obscuring the light source. This is especially true when you're dealing with a singular light source such as the sun, in theory. The fact that the moon's shadow is often 50 miles in diameter, or even much smaller than that, is a testament to the fact that the moon could not possibly be a 1,000-mile radius object. Shadows simply do not get smaller and smaller with proportionally with distance from the object obstructing the light source. That is not how light and shadows work. The shadow from the moon should be at least 1,000 miles in diameter to match the moon's alleged diameter, or even greater. And yet what we see is that the moon's shadow is never more than 100 miles in diameter when dealing with solar eclipses, which is completely incompatible with the theory of the ball Earth with a moon 250,000 miles away that's 1,000 miles in diameter. It is absolute nonsense that we see the shadow of the moon as small as we do in reality. Gravity allegedly keeps trillions of tons of water stuck to the side of the spinning ball Earth, but allows a butterfly or a sparrow or hummingbird to hover with ease. How is it possible for gravity to be so powerful that it keeps all of the trillions of tons of water stuck to the oceans and stuck to the side of the spinning ball, yet hummingbirds can easily hover? Now, this category, NASA is a liar, probably needs its own video. You could probably go on for an eternity pointing out all the examples of where NASA has been caught faking everything from the Apollo missions, the moon landings, the alleged pictures of the planets taken from like Pioneer 10, which allegedly went to Jupiter, went over 360 million miles, according to them, on 1970s technology, beaming back pictures of Jupiter millions of miles through the asteroid belt, 90 million miles of asteroids, and we're expected to believe this, and yet the pictures that they send are completely garbage. Their claims in terms of their timeline don't really add up. If you try to follow along with their timeline, it doesn't add up. I'll put a card to a video here that I did in regards to Pioneer 10. But the point is you can catch NASA red-handed with things like air bubbles during spacewalks, scuba divers in space, snorkels in space.
Some drama at NASA now. There will be several spacewalks who attend to a major problem, and this time they're using snorkels while they do it.
Clearly using every video trick or technology in the book that they can to fool people. My position is if you catch NASA lying even once, they should be stricken, they should be disbanded, defunded, get rid of them. Yet they're allowed to continue with an ever-increasing annual budget, which is now about $20 billion per year. The fact that the Earth is flat and stationary is unique in a respect that we're taught to believe that flat Earth is stupid. I can't think of anything else that you can actually find in like grade school textbooks where we're taught to believe that people were stupid for having this belief. The truth does not need to be reinforced by ridiculing the opponents to the truth. The truth should stand alone on its own without the need for playing games of semantics, without the need for ridiculing others involved, ad hominem attacks and such. And we find that the ball Earth versus the flat Earth is reinforced in the educational system uniquely by being taught as a stupid belief. So maybe there are a few other things that are taught as stupid beliefs in school. So for example, I don't know, barbers used to bleed people, so like drain your blood to try to heal you, which we now know is a silly thing to do. Although that fact, the fact that that belief is stupid is not pushed at all, or certainly not as heavily as the belief in flat Earth is stupid in the educational system. So that is to me a very valid point. Because again, I don't think it's necessary. If something is true, you don't need to bash the opponents or the people questioning that so-called fact. The inner solar system is visible past 11 p.m. As of recently, we observed the planet Venus after 11 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is categorically incompatible with the globe Earth theory, as Venus should be tighter around the Sun in its orbit to the Earth. Therefore, Venus should always be aligned to the day side of the Earth, and yet we can see instances of Venus past 11 p.m. This is simply not possible if we assume the ball Earth theory, and is adequate to debunk the ball Earth theory as a standalone piece of evidence. Airy's failure and other such experiments are really an interesting point to cover, because you have bona fide ball Earth believers who were doing experiments in order to support the theory that the Earth is in motion and rotating in the cosmos. And these experiments bring back results which disagree with the idea of the Earth being in motion, and indeed agree with the idea of the Earth being stationary, where the stars or the starlight and the ether which they exist in is in motion above and around us. So some examples, again, Airy's failure, the Michelson-Morley experiment, and these are experiments that are done with light and telescopes, reflectors, in order to determine whether it's the Earth in motion underneath the stars, and to what extent, or to trying to quantify the motion of the Earth, and coming back with results consistently that are null, or in other words, results that agree with the idea of the Earth being stationary and the heavenly bodies or luminaries being in motion. The lack of south polar flights, especially in comparison to the abundance of north polar flights, is a big key point. If the Earth was indeed a ball, you would expect to see flights from southern destinations, say from Australia to South America, South Africa to Australia, southern departure to southern destination in terms of the hemisphere. You would expect to see lots of direct flights, but what you find most of the time, the most traveled flight routes, in fact, go wildly out of their way to adhere to the north as much as possible, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense on a ball. The south polar area should be a shortcut to lots of destinations from lots of southern departure points, yet we find consistently that if you're going to fly from a southern departure point to a southern destination, you have to, or the flights for some reason adhere to the north as much as possible. Now, this does lend itself nicely to a flat Earth with an AE projection, and does not match itself nicely to a ball. So while the lack of south polar flights isn't necessarily a standalone piece of evidence, it certainly is something circumstantial that we can add to the pile of this preponderance of evidence. Now, the Antarctica Treaty is another one of these instances where the far south, the Antarctic, is allegedly, according to all accounts, even the United States Navy and Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the Antarctic is rich in natural resources. And so you would expect the corporate fascist governments of the world to take advantage of that in terms of our energy, in terms of preserving our local ecosystems, and just a litany of economical reasons as well as ecological reasons in order to tap the wealth of resources in the far south. And yet what we've gotten is the polar opposite of that in the form of the Antarctic Treaty, where essentially the law has made it practically impossible for free people to engage in a realistic, unobstructed surveying and mapping of the far southern region. Now, in fact, if you look at the accounts of mariners in the past who were able to freely pioneer the far south, they were consistently baffled by the Earth's not adhering, the far southern area is not adhering to the maps, assuming a globe Earth. So it appears, according to these ancient mariners, lots of ancient mariners, that the far southern region is much longer around than it should be if the Earth was indeed a ball. Speaking of the poles, you would expect the North Pole and the South Pole, if you're humoring the globe Earth theory, to be very similar in terms of temperature, wildlife, salinity of the water, or the salt content of the water. And in fact, we find that the Arctic and Antarctic are wildly different. The Antarctic is much colder by average and by record. There is practically no indigenous wildlife to be found in the Antarctic. While you will find a few species of like penguins and different very sparse species of bacteria and such, it is in stark contrast to the North Polar area, which is rich in wildlife, flora, fauna, is much more mild in terms of cold temperatures, and is certainly not the polar equal to the South Pole as you would expect on a ball Earth. A major point, which is indeed another one of these standalone proofs which is adequate on its own to debunk the ball Earth theory, is the fact that the Earth is indeed a fixed frame of reference. Any and all objects which are compelled to accelerate will eventually find a place of rest which is within the perfect frame of reference of the stationary Earth. Were the Earth indeed a spinning ball traveling in multiple directions simultaneously, as they would have you believe, it could not possibly be a fixed frame of reference. Now, it is argued that the Earth is a fixed frame of reference because, we only experience acceleration. We don't experience high speeds per se if we are talking about something that is relatively at an equal speed. Now, this argument may hold water if you're talking about traveling in straight lines or rectilinear paths. So, for example, if you're traveling in a train down a straight set of tracks at 50 miles an hour without accelerating, and you're riding along with that train, you won't feel any acceleration, and that is true. However, that is dealing with a straight line rectilinear frame of reference. Now, even assuming that, and let's examine the straight line fixed frame of reference, if you run towards the rear of the train, it is much easier relative to the train to do so than it is to run towards the front of a moving train. This is because an object in motion is not a fixed frame of reference, and furthermore, the Earth is allegedly not just in a rectilinear or straight line path. The Earth is allegedly spinning on an axis and is a ball, so just standing still on the Earth without any orbital velocities taken into account, we're talking about a curved linear path, which means we should experience constant angular acceleration, manifest as centrifugal force, and yet regardless of latitude, regardless of position on the ball, there is no measurable difference in centrifugal force. Furthermore, orbital velocities are not allegedly straight line paths, but are instead allegedly curved linear paths, which means we should constantly be experiencing acceleration in the form of angular acceleration, and yet no sort of orbital velocities or curved linear trajectories have ever been detected, felt, or measured. Now, there is a biblical connotation, which isn't so much as a category of proof, unless perhaps you're a Christian, but or really any religion. Muslim, Hebrew, and Christian holy books all have the world stated to be a stationary plane with the sun and moon doing circuits above, and science or hypothetical science have come along in the past couple hundred years and debunked that in air quotes. And so anybody that's from a religious background or claims to believe in these holy books should definitely take a look at Flat Earth, because it certainly won't disappoint. Now, another point, and this is indeed another one of these categories that you could list endless examples, but laser tests and the Bedford Level experiment always confirm the idea that the Earth is a plane. So the problem is that light bends does not always travel in straight lines, especially when light is traveling through some media like the atmosphere. The troposphere, the lower layer of the atmosphere, is rich in all sorts of gases and particulates, and light simply doesn't travel indefinitely in straight lines through this media. So we expect to see light bending down towards the ground when traveling parallel to the ground, and it appears that's exactly what we see. When ships go off into the distance over the horizon, to the naked eye, they will eventually merge with the horizon and appear to have gone over the curve of the Earth. Now, if you focus on that with a high-powered telescope or binoculars, the ship will be restored, which means it didn't go over any curve whatsoever. It merely has apparently merged with the vanishing point due to the angular size becoming too small for the eye to distinguish between the horizon and the ship. And also it shows that light is refracting down towards the ground, especially when we get these mirror images at great distances towards the horizon. But laser tests over many miles and the Bedford Level experiment over 6 miles, or any observation that you can do over standing water for many, many miles, always shows that the Earth doesn't curve down away from you. Eratosthenes Experiment is another one of the ball Earth's favorite go-to arguments. Even the ancient Greeks knew the Earth was a ball, but upon closer examination it's shown that the Eratosthenes Experiment doesn't prove anything unless you first assume that the Earth is a ball. The same data gathered by such experiments, measuring the angle of the shadow cast by the sun at high noon on the equinox, if you assume the Earth is a ball, then you can get a radius of that hypothetical ball, and you must also assume that the sun is very distant, extremely distant, practically infinitely distant. However, if you assume a local sun upon a flat Earth, then you get vastly different results to the same experimental values. So this is a testament to, if you assume that the Earth is a ball no matter what, then you can construct mathematics around that assumption to support that. However, mathematics can be ascribed to any number of hypothetical constructs, whether or not that construct is based in reality. The math will still be correct, but it proves nothing. The Umbra Penumbra theory is another one that has to do with light and shadow and how that behaves in reality, and juxtapose that with how light and shadow supposedly behaves in the ball Earth theory. Now, it's claimed by the ball Earth theory that the, say, moon, for example, when obstructing the sun for an observer on the Earth, casts a shadow that diminishes in angular size proportionally with distance from the obstruction. This is simply not how light and shadow work in reality, and yet we're expected to believe that's how light and shadow work in order to support the ball Earth theory. This is one of those disconnects from reality and observation that we must adhere to in order to continue believing in the ball Earth. Now, furthermore, we have a conflict between Eratosthenes experiment and this Umbra Penumbra theory, which goes, in order for the Eratosthenes experiment to work, we must assume that the sunlight is coming in at all perfectly or nearly perfectly parallel angles to one another in order to cast the shadows that we see upon the ball. However, in order for the Umbra Penumbra theory to work, the sunlight must be coming in at an angle to cast this bizarre conical stylus-like shadow of the moon. And so, which is it? Is the sunlight coming in at perfectly straight parallel lines, or is the sunlight coming in at a major divergent angle to cast this peculiar shadow of the moon? You simply can't have both, and the argument that we've gotten to this is that the sunlight is coming in at nearly perfectly parallel lines, and so nearly perfectly parallel is equivalent to divergent. However, that is it's a false step of logic. What we see, if we're to take what they're saying with the moon's shadow being this stylus-like bizarre convergent little pinpointer then we must assume that the angle of the sunlight is coming in at a widely divergent angle at the point that it hits the moon. That's the only way this sort of works in theory, and yet we know that at the point where the sunlight is hitting the moon, it must be coming in nearly perfectly parallel. So if that's the case, if the light was coming in nearly perfectly parallel, we'd expect to see a shadow of the moon that is, well, about 1,000 miles in radius. And frankly, the whole thing just falls apart under inspection. The only reason that Eratosthenes' values work is if you assume that the sun is nearly infinitely distant and the rays are coming in at practically parallel to one another. And the only way the Penumbra Umbra phenomenon works, where you've got the peculiar pinpointer shadow of the moon, is if the sunlight is coming in at a wildly divergent angle at that point. So you simply can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too, and yet that's exactly what we're expected to believe in the ball Earth theory. Another big point is the fakery of video evidence, or for example, fish-eyed lenses. Any video evidence that we've seen that depicts the curvature of the Earth can all be accounted to by using fish-eyed lenses. So we'll look at the Felix Baumgartner jump as an example. You can clearly see when they open the hatch here that the horizon is indeed at eye level. There is no curvature, around this area. And yet the very next shot is deliberately set up with the angles of the camera as well as the fisheye lens to create this drastic amount of curvature, which, if we're expected to believe that this amount of curvature exists at the altitude of about 100,000 feet, then apparently the state of New Mexico takes up about half of the ball Earth. Now, this is of course ridiculous. And it shows that there is deliberate deception going on at high levels, as the amount of planning and the shots that were given for this jump are very deliberate, and we know that at those altitudes you cannot see or detect any amount of curvature whatsoever, certainly not the drastic amounts of curvature that we see in these images. Circumnavigation is not exclusive to a ball, and yet we're taught that it is. Now, not to marry ourselves to any one model, but just to show that circumnavigation isn't exclusive to a ball. If you take the AE projection, circumnavigation can be achieved simply by aligning your compass to the central north and making a heading west or east. As you can see, all you're doing is transcribing a circle upon a plane, and it has nothing to do with going around a ball. And yet we're taught, we're programmed to believe that circumnavigation is somehow exclusive proof of a ball Earth. It is exactly this sort of deception and pseudoscience and anti-science that is drilled into our minds in order to concrete the notion that the Earth is a spinning ball. A huge point that I think everyone should consider is the fact that never once are we taught any sort of curvature formula in all of our education system until we start looking at flat Earth. I don't remember any one textbook having the 8 inches per mile squared formula to calculate the expected amount of curvature over a distance, other than Zetetic Astronomy, which was the first. And that's a flat Earth book. So isn't it sort of funny that the people who are doing the math and experiments related to the ball Earth are not the ball Earthers, but the flat Earthers, and that speaks volumes to this phenomenon. If the Earth were indeed a ball, you would expect to see lots of education around exactly how spherical the Earth is and how we can practically predict or measure the expected curvature on this ball, and yet you won't find anything. I challenge anyone to provide a K through 12 or even regular non-advanced college level book that discusses the curvature of the Earth in any real, measurable, quantifiable fashion. And I would even be willing to bet that highly advanced geology books and highly advanced science class books textbooks have no mention of the Earth's curvature or any sort of formula on how we could predict curvature over a given distance. But if there is such a thing, I am unaware of it, other than flat Earth books. Architects and engineers responsible for bridges, canals, and other large projects spanning large portions of the ball must not assume curvature by law. This means if you're an architect or an engineer, you assume that the Earth is a plane for all of your construction projects. That is by law. If you build bridges or even very tall buildings or canals or tunnels with the assumption that the Earth is a sphere, and you include that curvature into your construction plans, you're going to come out with complete screw-ups. And that has been demonstrated, and any architectural engineering projects assume the planar nature of the Earth as a given, as a law, period. This point is really evidence against the spinning ball Earth. In theory, we're expected to believe that from dusk till dawn, any observer is being accelerated to a complete opposite inertial reference frame, a total of over 140,000 miles an hour. When the sun is coming up, we're expected to believe that the ball Earth is rushing up towards our legs at 66,000 miles an hour, and over the course of 12 hours, we're expected to believe that we spin around the axis till the sun goes down, when the Earth is allegedly dropping down away from our legs at 66,000 miles an hour. A total acceleration of over 140,000 miles an hour every 12 hours of every day ever, and yet nobody can ever detect, measure, quantify, show evidence, any sort of evidence for this wild acceleration. If we were indeed traveling at such ball-breaking velocities, it would be measurable. There would be lots of experiments, not just the Foucault pendulum experiment, to support this theory that we're hauling ass through space in multiple directions at once, no less, spinning around an axis. The notion is quite absurd. And, look at the propaganda which they have been pushing for decades. Pop culture, science fiction, science books, NASA, all of this is a heavy propaganda which leads people to believe in the fantasy of infinite space. The fact is, all we know for sure about space is that the sky is above us and NASA is a liar. Anything beyond that, we can pretty much assume that infinite space doesn't exist. There are not lots of little planet potential destinations out there in the vast reaches of the hypothetical universe. The planar Earth is the only physical place in all of reality. What happens and exists in the sky is merely like a light show or a fireworks show. Has nothing to do with physical reality. Just because the moon and the sun appear to be spheres does not make the Earth a sphere. The fact of the matter is, when you assume that the Earth is a spinning ball no matter what evidence is presented to you, then you will never be able to unlock yourself from this programming, from this mind control device, which is more or less designed to destroy our self-respect, self-confidence. And when you have a culture that is built on a lack of self-respect, it is nearly impossible to respect the natural world, and as a extension of that. So these were just a few rapid-fire pieces of evidence and arguments for the flat, motionless Earth and fake space, as well as debunks of the hypothetical ball Earth theory. And yet, even when being confronted with all of this evidence, ball Earthers will simply bury their heads in the sand, call anyone pointing to such evidences or making such claims as stupid, science-denying morons, and yet won't come back with any logical arguments against these points and many, many others. Again, this isn't intended to cover every single point or proof or evidence. There is an entire world full of things that prove conclusively that we don't live stuck to the side of a spinning ball in the infinite vacuum of space, and indeed the Earth is a motionless plane, space is above us, and there are lots of mysteries to the world. How far does the plane extend? Are there other civilizations beyond our known realm? Will it ever be possible for us or even our descendants to fully understand what's going on the world? With that, I'm going to wrap this up, guys. Thanks everyone for watching. God bless. If you'd like to support this channel, your contributions are greatly appreciated and needed. If you'd like to make a one-time contribution through PayPal, you can do www.paypal.me/themorguile, or through Patreon for as little as $1 per month with a recurring contribution to www.patreon.com/themorguile. With that, again, thanks all for watching. Love you guys. God bless. And spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
You understand science is good education, you freaking retard, my stupid videos. What you talking about sloppy? I'm talking sloppy. Videos, you stupid retard videos that you make. Cause everybody knows that you can't show this again. You stop showing these things right now.
Make the earth shake. Rock on. Make the earth shake. Rock on. Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake.